Rest by James Cone. To affirm that liberation is an expression of the image of God is to say not only who God is, but also who I am and who my people are. Liberation is knowledge of self. It is a vocation to affirm who I am created to be. Furthermore, it is clear from divine revelation, as witnessed in Scripture, that authentic liberation of self is attainable only in the context of an oppressed community in the struggle for freedom. Because God's freedom for humanity is the divine liberation of the oppressed from bondage. Human freedom, as a response to God's gracious liberation, is an act for our brothers and sisters who are oppressed. There can be no freedom for God in isolation from the humiliated and the abused. There can be no freedom for God unless the hungry are fed, the sick are healed, and justice is given to the poor. How can we claim to be liberated, or in the process of liberation, in the Christian sense, if the structure and meaning of liberation are not derived from the oppressed community in its struggle for freedom? No one can be truly liberated unless all are liberated. And until that eschatological event happens, the measure of liberation achievable is limited to the consciousness of freedom as defined by the oppressed and the downtrodden in their fight for justice. In an unjust society, freedom for Christ can be found only among those who are in chains.
This is a short excerpt from a speech that Representative John Lewis made. In it, he offers a number of very familiar ideas that we've probably heard before, but kind of culminate here at the end of his life. It's always good to hear them from the man himself in his own words. I give you John Lewis.
When we would visit Montgomery, visit Tuskegee, visit Birmingham, I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. As a young child, I tasted the bitter fruits of segregation and racial discrimination, and I didn't like it. I've asked my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why segregation, why racial discrimination? And they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But one day in 1955, at the age of 15, in the 10th grade, I heard about Rosa Parks. I heard Dr. King speaking on old radio. The leadership of Dr. King, his words, the action of Rosa Parks inspired me to find a way to get in the way. I got in trouble. It was good trouble. It was necessary trouble. Barbara Lee, Mayor Harris, been getting in trouble. I have the feeling that here today, we're too quiet. We're too quiet. We need to make some noise. We need to find a way to get in the way. We need to find a way to get in good trouble, necessary trouble, if we're going to save America.
One can hardly forget how it started. A police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota, just about as far north as you can get, held his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And although that was the time that would later be made famous, body camera footage actually clocked it in at 9 minutes, 30 seconds. At any rate, a white man put his full weight down on the neck of a black man until he stopped breathing. Perhaps there is no better metaphor for race in America today than that. Of course, like many other victims of racial violence and murder, George Floyd isn't just George Floyd. He became a symbol of something much larger than himself. He became a symbol of something, a symbol of all the accumulated shooting and police brutality that we have witnessed in the past decade. He became a symbol of the frustrations within the African American community, of the backlash that they've been subjected to ever since Obama left office. He became a symbol of the collective frustration of a nation fed up with a pandemic that had stymied our political leaders' vision for what to do and how to fix it. All of those forces were at work last summer as it kicked off last Memorial Day. Last summer made us Americans pause and hopefully reflect on the fact that electing one black man president did not, in fact, magically heal all of the racial wounds that our country has endured. Race is still a factor in our nation. The brutality of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's deaths showed that black folks in our country are not as free as we'd like to assume. Breonna Taylor was in her apartment in Louisville, Kentucky. George Floyd bought cigarettes at a local corner store. These were not radical political statements they were trying to make. They were just living their lives until the moment they weren't. And that's the point driven home to us this summer. That in America, in 2020, we came to see that oppression is real and it is systemic. Oppression has only one antidote: liberation. Liberation means freedom, but also more than freedom. Liberation is not just being free of slavery or some other oppressive institution. Liberation is a state of being, a state of the soul. It's the ability to imagine for oneself a better world, a better life, and being able to take actions that bring that better world into the being here and now. We don't wait until after death to experience liberation. We experience it here. Luke's gospel says that the kingdom of God is all around us, yet men and women do not see it. Liberation happens here and now, or it doesn't happen at all. That's a summary of what Christians call liberation theology. Now, liberation theology is an interpretation of Christian, primarily Catholic teachings. It emerged in Latin America in the 1980s as part of a critique both of the Catholic Church and the dramatically unjust regimes in Central and South America who are oppressing thousands of people in order to maintain wealth and power. It's an interesting mix of Christian epical thinking, the Exodus narrative, and more than a little bit of Marxism thrown in. This is Christianity that is for the poor and oppressed. Now, liberation theology may have started in Latin America, but it did not stay there. It soon spread all over the world to any place where people are discriminated against. The African American version of liberation theology was most eloquently stated by the author of our reading today, James Cone, who actually just died in the last year. In his book, A Black Theology of Liberation, Cone applies the teachings of liberation theology to the African American experience. We actually read from his third book, God of the Oppressed. Now, bear in mind that Cone comes out of the African American Protestant Church, for whom Jesus is the undisputed center. However, it is Cone who is frequently cited by UU ministers, the likes of Sophia Betancourt and William Sinkford. Liberation theology is very explicitly named as the theological foundation of Widening the Circle, the Commission on Institutional Change's report that we've been studying this past year. So while James Cone is not himself Unitarian Universalist by any stretch of the imagination, his work is highly influential among us. Liberation is a vision of a world made whole, one in which injustice has been corrected and people live in peace, true peace, not merely the absence of violence. It's a religious vision because it is of the broadest and deepest perspective one can have. As Cone wrote in our reading today, liberation involves everyone. No one is free until everyone is free. That's not to say that the oppressor and the oppressed are the same from a moral point of view, but it is an acknowledgement that we are interconnected. How ironic that Christianity has come to adopt the language of liberation a term used in Eastern religion, particularly Hinduism, as a synonym for salvation. Hindus believe that our goal is to attain spiritual liberation from our karma. They call this moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth. Unlike the Hindu version, though, this form of liberation as salvation has a specifically material component. We cannot ignore that we are physical beings and that economic oppression limits the freedom of so many people. Thus, to be liberated from these oppressive economic conditions means that we cannot be satisfied with theology alone. Theology demands action. Action is intrinsic to any theology we may consider or adopt. My destiny is tied to yours, and your destiny is tied to mine. Therefore, we are called to be bodhisattvas, beings that act to liberate others first before themselves. I like to call that the bodhisattva attitude. It is action in the real world that arises out of spiritual insight and compassion. Few have ever lived out that bodhisattva spirit of being for others before themselves, as well as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, that said, one of his friends and confidants did pretty well in his own right. I'm speaking of the late representative from Georgia, John Lewis. John Lewis was one of those heroes of the civil rights movement before becoming a congressman representing Atlanta in the House of Representatives. His influence on future generations cannot be overstated. Obama was inspired by John Lewis. And I want to just read real briefly an article that was published shortly after John Lewis's funeral. Obama, for whom Lewis was an inspiration and hero, called Lewis a man of, quote, unbreakable perseverance, and said that he embodied that most American of ideas, that idea that any of us, ordinary people, without rank or wealth or title or fame, can somehow point out the imperfections of this nation and come together and challenge the status quo and decide that it is in our power to remake this country that we love until it is more closely aligned with our highest ideals, end quote. John Lewis died of cancer last summer, but not before seeing some of the fruit of his legacy in the form of the Black Lives Matter movement. After his death, the New York Times published a letter Lewis wrote specifically to that movement after he was gone. And it's an extraordinary document and says better than I can what the man thought and what he hoped others would do after him. Though I was surrounded by two loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside that family circle. Unchecked, unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best, shoot unwitting concert goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McClain. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said, we're all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said, it's not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said, each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. And when you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state. It is an act. And each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participation in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. John Lewis's vision, the vision of the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, is one of liberation. It is peace through justice for everyone in America, regardless of race or any other potential difference that could lead to division. He was for something greater than himself. The difference between his notion of good trouble and the kind of trouble that the insurrectionists at the Capitol last week, that we saw last week, could not be more stark. Sure, they have a vision. They give themselves to a cause greater than themselves, technically speaking, but that vision is one of hate and division. It is an understanding of America that never was, but longed for. Their vision is one in which white people exist at the top of the social and political hierarchy, never to come down. There is nothing good about the trouble they got into last week. And so it falls to us to imagine a world made whole in which all are liberated. Imagination is actually our theme for the month of January. We need a vision that is as compelling as John Lewis's if we are to combat racist ideology and white supremacy in the competition of ideas. One example of such a vision is the proposed eighth principle that's being considered by congregations around the world, and as you no doubt saw this past week, by our congregation as well. The eighth principle reads, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. I know the language is inelegant, to say the least, but the poetry isn't the point at this point. It is the spirit of the message that I want to focus on. Contained in that sentence is our collective UU vision for liberation. Notice the term beloved community, also used by John Lewis. It's an idea that comes directly from Martin Luther King to describe a community that has liberated itself. That's what we're striving to become. And in that sense, it's appropriate to list it among our principles. As the year moves on, you will hear more about the eighth principle and its meaning. No doubt you saw the letter from the board and myself that just went out about this eighth principle. You'll have a chance to engage with it, chew on it, reflect on it with your fellow UUs here in the Hudson Valley and throughout the country. And since we're just at the beginning of this reflection together, let me be the first to throw out something for us to wrestle with. I said before that theology isn't theology if it's just some pretty ideas. Philosophy is just a bunch of pretty ideas. Theology goes deeper. Theology speaks to how we exist in the world. To adopt a theology means you have a specific and particular orientation to life. To change theologies or to add to an existing one means that you live your life differently. And so my question is, if we as Unitarian Universalists adopt the eighth principle, what does that mean? How are we going to live differently, individually and collectively, because of the eighth principle? Surely it means something, otherwise why make a change at all? If it's merely an exercise in collective wordsmithing, then I don't know that too many people would be interested. We do too much of that as it is already. So if the eighth principle means something to us, how do we practice Unitarian Universalism different after it is adopted? How do we alter our day-to-day lives? How does it change who we are and what we do? For it must change what we do. Action must result, or else it is not theology. We cannot let attacks like what happened at the Capitol be the definitive word on American values or our practice of democracy. We need a better vision and a more compelling way to live. We need liberation. I want to give the last word this morning to that towering bodhisattva who now lives among the cloud of witnesses at our shoulders, Representative John Lewis. He closed his letter with these words. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I've done all I can to demonstrate the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. Amen. Go in peace. Please join now.
Please join me in the dedication of the offering, which is found on the screen. May these gifts and the work of our hands and hearts give power to all we stand for as a community of faith. And now, please join me in extinguishing the chalice. The words are found in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
We can dare to face ourselves in our entirety, to understand our pain, to feel the tears, to listen to our frustrations and confusion, and to discover new capacities and capabilities that will empower and transform us.
Thank you for joining us this morning. We would also like to give special thanks to